Millionaire goes into an abandoned garage every day with a Mexican girl. Neighbor is shocked to find out why. The first snowfall of winter descended on Brookdale like a whisper, transforming the small American suburb into a scene from a vintage postcard. Miriam Caldwell stood at her bedroom window, watching as the flakes gathered on the sill. At 72, she'd become an expert at holding herself together, while everything around her threatened to collapse. The 3 years since her husband's passing had taught her to push loneliness aside when necessary. But tonight, as she traced a pattern in the frost forming on the glass, those carefully constructed walls were beginning to crack. For months now, something had been bothering her. Every night, a sleek black car would silently glide down her street and disappear into an abandoned garage at the end of the block. The driver was Emiliano Reyes, once a wealthy Mexican philanthropist who had been a pillar of their community. And always with him was a little girl named Valeria, whose bright yellow dress seemed to contrast with the sadness in her eyes. The mystery of their presence in Brookdale had begun to consume Miriam's thoughts. The community club had once been her sanctuary, the meetings and activities a welcome distraction from the emptiness of the house. But her friends there had grown, tired of her observations about the mysterious Emiliano and Valeria. "You're seeing things that aren't there, Miriam," her friend Dorothy had said with a gentle pat on her hand. "Not everything is a mystery to be solved." Now, with nothing but time stretching before her like an endless highway, Miriam felt the weight of silence pressing down. The old house seemed to breathe around her, creaking and settling, as if reminding her of its presence. She'd always loved this house with its ornate woodwork and secret corners, but tonight it felt like a museum of memories she wasn't ready to confront. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window frame, startling her. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Almost time. The black car would be making its appearance soon, and her neighbor's dismissal of her concerns had only strengthened her resolve to discover the truth. Tomorrow would mark another day of watching and wondering, and the thought filled her with a strange mixture of dread and determination. What was happening with Emiliano and that sad-eyed little girl? Why were they hiding in an abandoned garage? As the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet stillness, Miriam made a decision. If her neighbors wouldn't believe her, she would have to find proof herself. The morning arrived with harsh clarity, sunlight reflecting off the snow-covered ground and streaming through Miriam's bedroom window. She hadn't slept well, her dreams filled with black cars and abandoned garages and the sad eyes of a little girl in yellow. Coffee in hand, she stood in her kitchen surrounded by decades of accumulated domestic life. The antique spice rack she and her late husband had found at a flea market, the collection of hand-painted plates from their anniversary trips, the refrigerator still adorned with old photographs of grandchildren who now rarely visited. Her phone buzzed with a text from her closest friend, Dorothy. "Club meeting at 11. Will you be joining us today?" Miriam sighed. Dorothy had been skeptical of her obsession with the Reyes situation, as had most of the other club members. Bill Thompson had even joked that she was just a lonely widow looking for excitement. And Lisa, a young mother in the neighborhood, had suggested that Miriam might be harboring prejudice against Emiliano because of his Mexican heritage. "I'll be there," she typed back, knowing that isolation would only feed her loneliness. 3. Dots appeared immediately. "No mysterious strangers today, please." Bill is still rolling his eyes from last time. At the community club, Dorothy was already waiting, her organizational skills evident in the neat arrangement of refreshments she'd prepared. At 70, Dorothy radiated a confidence that Miriam had always admired. Widowed for a decade but maintaining an active social life and community presence. "You look tired," Dorothy said by way of greeting, pushing a plate of cookies toward Miriam. "But these might help. It's that ridiculous recipe with the toffee bits you like." Miriam took a cookie gratefully. "Thanks for your honesty. And the snack." "Always. Now tell me you've given up on this Reyes business." Miriam sighed, staring into her coffee. "I can't, Dorothy. Something isn't right. That little girl, Valeria, she never smiles. And Emiliano looks so different from the man I remember seeing in charity events years ago. His suit is worn now, and he looks afraid. Dorothy's expression softened. "Oh, Miriam, I know you mean well, but not everything is a mystery to solve. Some people just fall on hard times." "It's more than that," Miriam insisted. "I've been watching them for weeks. They never interact with anyone. They come and go at odd hours. They're hiding something, I'm sure of it." Before Dorothy could respond, Bill Thompson joined them, his perpetually skeptical eyebrows already raised. "Is our neighborhood detective at it again?" he asked, helping himself to coffee. "I was just telling Miriam that her imagination is getting the better of her," Dorothy said with a meaningful look at Bill. "It's not imagination when you see the same thing night after night," Miriam defended herself. "Emiliano Reyes was once one of the wealthiest men in this area. His charity foundation built the new wing of the hospital. Now he's living in an abandoned garage with a little girl. And you don't find that strange?" Bill shrugged. "Rich people lose money all the time. Maybe he made bad investments. Maybe he gambled it away. Maybe he's hiding from the IRS. Either way, it's none of our business." "But what about the child? What about Valeria?" Miriam pressed, leaning forward. "She should be in school, not hiding in a garage. She always looks sad, always wears the same yellow dress. What if she's in danger? What if she needs help?" Lisa, who had been listening from nearby, joined the conversation. "Miriam, I'm concerned that you're fixating on the Reyes family simply because they're different. Not every Hispanic family with problems needs a white savior." The words stung, and Miriam felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "This has nothing to do with their heritage. I would be just as concerned if they were any other family." The meeting continued, but Miriam felt increasingly isolated. She listened half-heartedly to announcements about the upcoming winter festival and community garden plans for spring, her mind drifting back to the black car and the abandoned garage. That evening, determined to prove her concerns legitimate, Miriam stationed herself near her front window with a notebook and pen. She would document the comings and goings, create a record that even her skeptical friends couldn't dismiss. As darkness fell, the black car appeared right on schedule, gliding silently down the street before disappearing into the garage. Miriam noted the time. 7:45 p.m. She watched as a dim light appeared in the garage window, barely visible from her vantage point. Through her binoculars, purchased years ago for birdwatching with her late husband, she could make out two shadows moving inside. The smaller one, Valeria presumably, seemed to be sitting on what looked like a makeshift bed, while the taller figure moved about restlessly. Night after night, Miriam continued her vigil, filling pages with observations. Emiliano and Valeria typically arrived around the same time each evening, but left at varying hours in the morning. Occasionally they would depart again late at night, returning an hour or so later with what appeared to be takeout food. The yellow dress remained a constant, though Miriam noticed it was beginning to look increasingly worn and dirty. After 2 weeks of observation, Miriam decided it was time to take a more active approach. One particularly cold evening, she waited until the black car had been parked for about an hour, then bundled up in her warmest coat and boots. With a basket containing a homemade casserole, fresh bread, and a small teddy bear she'd purchased for Valeria, she made her way down the street. Her heart pounded as she approached the garage. What if her friends were right? What if she was just a bored widow inventing mysteries where none existed? But then she thought of Valeria's sad eyes and Emiliano's haunted expression, and her resolve strengthened. If nothing was wrong, she would simply be a neighborly presence offering a warm meal. No harm in that. The garage looked even more dilapidated up close, its peeling paint and cracked windows testament to years of neglect. Miriam hesitated at what appeared to be a side door, then took a deep breath and knocked firmly. The sound of hurried movement came from inside, followed by silence. Miriam knocked again. "Mr. Reyes, it's Miriam Caldwell from down the street. I've brought some dinner for you and Valeria." More silence, then the sound of whispered conversation. Finally, the door opened a crack, revealing Emiliano's wary face. Up close, the transformation from the confident philanthropist she remembered to this haggard, suspicious man was even more striking. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. his accent more pronounced than she recalled. "What do you want?" Miriam smiled, holding up her basket. "Just to be neighborly. I noticed you and your daughter have been staying here, and I thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal." Emiliano's expression flickered between suspicion and gratitude. "That is very kind, but unnecessary." From behind him, a small voice spoke. "Papa, what is it?" "Nothing, Carino. Go back to your homework." Miriam caught a glimpse of Valeria before Emiliano shifted to block the view. The yellow dress was definitely the same one she'd been wearing for weeks, and her thin arms suggested she hadn't been eating well. "Please," Miriam said, lowering her voice. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just concerned. If you're in some kind of difficulty, perhaps I could help." Emiliano's posture stiffened. "We don't need help. We're fine." "You're living in an abandoned garage in winter with a young child," Miriam pointed out gently. "That doesn't seem fine to me." For a moment, it seemed like Emiliano might close the door in her face. Then, surprisingly, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "It is temporary," he said quietly, "until I can resolve some issues." "May I come in just for a moment?" Miriam asked, sensing a crack in his defensive armor. After a brief hesitation, Emiliano stepped back, allowing her entry into what had once been a two-car garage and was now a makeshift living space. A camping stove sat in one corner, while two sleeping bags were laid out on air mattresses in another. A small folding table held school books and a battery-powered lamp. Despite the obvious poverty of their circumstances, everything was meticulously neat and organized. Valeria sat cross-legged on one of the sleeping bags, a math workbook open before her. She looked up at Miriam with wide, cautious eyes. "Hello, Valeria," Miriam said warmly, setting down her basket. "I'm Mrs. Caldwell. I live down the street." The girl looked to her father, who nodded slightly before responding. "Hello, Mrs. Caldwell. I've brought you both some dinner and a little something for you," Miriam said, removing the teddy bear from her basket and offering it to Valeria. The child's face lit up momentarily, the first genuine smile Miriam had seen from her, before she glanced at her father again, seemingly seeking permission. "You may take it," Emiliano said softly. "Say thank you." "Thank you," Valeria whispered, clutching the bear to her chest. Miriam began unpacking the food, asking casual questions about Valeria's schoolwork while trying to put them at ease. Gradually, she steered the conversation toward their situation. "Mr. Reyes, forgive my directness, but I remember you as a very successful businessman. Your foundation did wonderful work in our community. What happened?" Emiliano's expression darkened. "Life happened, Mrs. Caldwell. Investments fail, trusted partners betray, fortune changes." "And now you're hiding in a garage?" His eyes snapped to hers. "What makes you think we're hiding? You arrive late, leave early, never interact with neighbors. The car has out-of-state plates. Valeria isn't enrolled in the local school." Miriam listed her observations matter-of-factly. "It doesn't take a detective to see that you're avoiding attention." For a long moment, Emiliano said nothing, just studied Miriam's face as if searching for something. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. "Some men are looking for us. Men I owe money to. Men who would not hesitate to use unpleasant methods to collect what they believe I owe them." Miriam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the garage's inadequate heating. "You're in danger?" "I am," he admitted. "And by extension, so is Valeria. Her mother died 3 years ago. I am all she has left." Valeria had fallen asleep, clutching her new teddy bear, giving the adults freedom to speak more openly. "Why don't you go to the police?" Miriam asked. Emiliano laughed without humor. "These are not men the police can easily touch. Besides, I did make the investments willingly. I did sign the papers. The fact that I was misled about the nature of those investments would be difficult to prove." "So you're just going to live in this garage forever? What kind of life is that for Valeria?" "It is temporary," Emiliano insisted. "Just until I can repay enough to negotiate some peace. I have been working nights as a janitor at the mall. It is not much, but it's something." Miriam sat back, considering the situation. You need a proper place to stay. Somewhere safe, with heat and running water. Somewhere Valeria can have a stable environment. We have managed for 3 months, Emiliano said stiffly. We will continue to manage. Or, Miriam said carefully, you could stay with me. The offer surprised even herself. This man was essentially a stranger, potentially bringing dangerous complications into her life, and yet, looking at Valeria's sleeping form and Emiliano's exhausted face, she knew it was the right thing to do. I have a 3-bedroom house, she continued, when Emiliano didn't immediately respond. It's just me rattling around in it since my husband passed. You and Valeria could have your own rooms. It would be warm, safe, and no one would think to look for you there. Emiliano shook his head. I could not impose, and if these men were to find us, you would be in danger as well. I'm 72 years old, Miriam said with a slight smile. Danger is no longer something I fear very much. Besides, who would suspect an elderly widow of harboring fugitives? The word made Emiliano wince. We are not criminals, Mrs. Caldwell. I didn't mean to imply that you were, she assured him. But you are running from something, and my home could be a sanctuary while you sort things out. For several minutes, Emiliano sat in silence, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he looked at his sleeping daughter, her thin arms wrapped around the teddy bear, and his resolve seemed to crumble. Perhaps, just for a little while, he conceded. Until I can make other arrangements. I would pay rent, of course, from my wages. We can discuss details later, Miriam said, standing up. For tonight, finish your dinner and get some rest. Tomorrow you can pack your things and move in after dark. As she walked home through the snowy streets, Miriam wondered if she had lost her mind. Taking in a desperate man and his daughter, possibly putting herself in the path of dangerous creditors. It wasn't the sort of thing a sensible widow in a quiet suburb did. What would Dorothy say? Or skeptical Bill Thompson? Or judgmental Lisa? But for the first time in months, perhaps years, Miriam felt truly alive. The emptiness that had haunted her since her husband's death had temporarily receded, replaced by a sense of purpose. These two people needed help, and she was in a position to provide it. It was as simple and as complicated as that. The following evening, as promised, Emiliano's black car pulled into Miriam's driveway around 10 p.m. Their possessions, pitifully, few were quickly carried inside. Valeria's eyes widened as she took in the cozy living room with its plush furniture and family photographs. It's like a castle, she whispered to her father, who smiled sadly. Not quite, Carino, but a very kind place for us to stay for a while. Miriam showed them to their rooms, the larger guest room for Valeria, and a converted office with a pull-out sofa for Emiliano. She'd spent the day preparing, changing sheets, clearing closet space, even purchasing a few necessities she thought they might need. The bathroom is at the end of the hall, she explained. There are fresh towels, and I put some toiletries in there for you both. The kitchen is always open, help yourselves to anything. I tend to wake up early, but don't feel you need to keep my schedule. Emiliano seemed overwhelmed by her generosity. Mrs. Caldwell. Miriam, please. Miriam, he corrected. I don't know how to thank you properly. There's no need, she assured him. Now get some rest. We'll figure out next steps tomorrow. Later that night, as Miriam lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of other people moving about her house, she felt a strange sense of contentment. The walls that had closed in around her for so long now sheltered others who needed protection. The silence that had been her constant companion was broken by the soft footfalls of Valeria padding to the bathroom, the low murmur of Emiliano's voice as he spoke soothingly to his daughter. Perhaps her friends had been right that she was just a lonely widow, looking for distraction. But they had been wrong to dismiss her concerns about Emiliano and Valeria. Whatever troubles had brought them to that garage, whatever dangers still pursued them, Miriam was now a part of their story. And for the first time in 3 years, her own story felt like it might not be over after all. 3 weeks passed, and life in Miriam's house settled into an unexpected rhythm. Valeria, who had been receiving sporadic homeschooling from her father, began to flourish under Miriam's gentle tutelage. A former elementary school teacher before her retirement, Miriam discovered she still had a knack for making learning engaging. Emiliano continued his night job at the mall, but had also found day work at a local warehouse, exhausting himself but steadily building up his savings. Dorothy, of course, had opinions about Miriam's new house guests. "You've lost your mind," she declared over coffee in Miriam's kitchen, keeping her voice low to avoid being overheard by Valeria, who was doing schoolwork in the living room. "Taking in strangers, and not just any strangers, a man running from debt collectors. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking that a child shouldn't have to live in a freezing garage," Miriam replied calmly. "And I was right to be concerned, wasn't I?" My obsession turned out to be well-founded. Dorothy couldn't argue with that. "Still, it's dangerous. What if these men he owes money to come looking for him here?" "Then I'll deal with it," Miriam said, with more confidence than she felt. "Besides, no one knows they're staying with me. The car is parked in my garage now, and they're very careful about coming and going." "And how long is this arrangement supposed to last? You've turned your life upside down for people you barely know." Miriam considered the question. "As long as necessary, I suppose. Emiliano is saving money. Eventually, he'll have enough to negotiate with his creditors or perhaps relocate somewhere safer. In the meantime, I'm enjoying the company." That much was true. After years of solitude, the house felt alive again. Valeria's laughter, increasingly frequent as she began to feel secure, filled rooms that had been silent too long. Even Emiliano, despite his constant wariness, had moments of warmth and humor that reminded Miriam of the charismatic community leader he had once been. "Just be careful," Dorothy warned as she prepared to leave. "Your heart is in the right place, but this situation could turn dangerous quickly." Miriam nodded, accepting her friend's concern while knowing she wouldn't change course. Something about Emiliano and Valeria had awakened her dormant maternal instincts, stirring a protective determination she hadn't known she still possessed. That evening, as Miriam helped Valeria with a particularly challenging math problem, the girl suddenly looked up with serious eyes. "Mrs. Caldwell, are you lonely without your husband?" The question caught Miriam off guard. "Sometimes," she admitted, "it's hard to be alone after sharing your life with someone for so many years." Valeria nodded, her expression wise beyond her years. "I miss my mama like that. Papa tries to make it better, but there's still a hole." "That's a very grown-up way of looking at it," Miriam said gently. "The holes never completely close, but we learn to live around them." "Is that why you let us stay? Because of your hole?" Children's directness could be startling. Miriam considered the question carefully. Partially, perhaps, but also because it was the right thing to do. Sometimes helping others helps heal our own wounds a little bit. Valeria seemed satisfied with this answer and returned to her math problems. Later, after she had gone to bed, Emiliano joined Miriam. In the living room, his exhaustion evident in the dark circles under his eyes. "Valeria asked me something interesting today," Miriam said, pouring him a cup of tea. "She wondered if I let you stay because I was lonely." Emiliano looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, children can be too direct sometimes." "No need to apologize. It was a fair question." Miriam smiled. "And not entirely wrong." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Emiliano spoke again. "I've been thinking about your question, why I don't go to the police. The truth is more complicated than I initially shared." Miriam waited patiently as he gathered his thoughts. "The men I owe money to, they are cartel adjacent, you might say. Not directly involved in drugs, but in the money laundering side. I didn't know this when I accepted their investment in my business ventures. By the time I realized where the money came from, I was already deeply entangled." He sighed heavily. "When my investments failed, I couldn't repay them. They threatened Valeria, so we ran." "Oh, Emiliano," Miriam breathed, the full gravity of the situation sinking in. "This is even more serious than I thought." "Now you understand why the police cannot help," he said quietly, "and perhaps why you should reconsider your generosity toward us." Miriam shook her head firmly. "No, that doesn't change anything. Valeria needs safety, and you need time to figure out a solution. My offer stands." Emiliano's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "You are an extraordinary woman, Miriam Caldwell." The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect winter day. Miriam had promised to take Valeria to a nearby park that was typically deserted on weekday mornings, a rare chance for the child to play outdoors without fear of being seen by the wrong people. Bundled in warm clothes borrowed from Miriam's grandchildren's forgotten belongings, Valeria was practically bouncing with excitement. "Remember, Carino," Emiliano cautioned as they prepared to leave, "if you see anyone approaching, you come back to Mrs. Caldwell immediately." "I know, Papa," Valeria said, her eyes rolling slightly in the universal gesture of children who have heard the same instruction too many times. Miriam chuckled. "We'll be fine, Emiliano. The park is usually empty this time of day, and we won't stay long." The park was indeed deserted when they arrived, the freshly fallen snow unmarked except for a few animal tracks. Valeria ran toward the swings, her yellow dress, freshly washed and mended by Miriam, bright against the white landscape, now mostly hidden beneath a puffy blue coat. As Miriam watched the child play, her heart swelled with affection. In just 3 weeks, Valeria had transformed from a solemn, watchful child into one who laughed and played, though still with moments of grown-up solemnity that spoke to her difficult experiences. "Hiya, Mrs. Caldwell," Valeria called from the swing. "I want to touch the sky." Miriam obliged, pushing gently but firmly, enjoying the child's delighted squeals. She was so focused on Valeria that she didn't notice the black SUV that had pulled into the parking lot until it was too late. 2 men emerged, walking purposefully toward them. They were well-dressed in expensive winter coats, but something about their movements set off alarm bells in Miriam's mind. "Valeria," she said quietly, slowing the swing, "I think it's time to go." The girl, sensing the change in Miriam's tone, immediately jumped from the swing. "Is it them?" she whispered, fear suddenly evident in her eyes. "I don't know, sweetheart, but let's not wait to find out." Miriam took Valeria's hand, trying to guide her toward a side path that would lead them away from the approaching men. "Mrs. Caldwell?" One of the men called out, his voice carrying across the snow-covered playground. "A moment of your time, please." Miriam froze. They knew her name. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran through her. "Run to those trees," she whispered to Valeria. "Hide and don't come out until I call for you." Valeria hesitated, clearly torn between following instructions and not wanting to leave Miriam alone. "Go now," Miriam urged, giving her a gentle push. "Your father would want you safe." That was all it took. Valeria darted toward the small copse of trees at the edge of the park, her blue coat quickly disappearing among the evergreens. Miriam turned to face the approaching men, drawing herself up to her full height, which wasn't much, but her decades as a schoolteacher had taught her how to project authority despite her stature. "Gentlemen," she said coolly as they reached her, "how can I help you?" The taller of the 2 men smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm Victor Salazar. This is my associate, Ramon. We believe you've been harboring a friend of ours, Emiliano Reyes, and his daughter." "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," Miriam replied, her heart pounding but her voice steady. Salazar's smile tightened. "Please, Mrs. Caldwell, we've been watching your house. We know they're staying with you. Emiliano owes us a considerable sum of money, and we simply want what's ours." "If you've been watching my house, then you know I'm just a widow who lives alone," Miriam said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I was enjoying my morning walk." She tried to step around them, but Ramon moved to block her path. "The girl?" he said, his voice softer but somehow more menacing than Salazar's. "Where did she go?" "What girl?" Miriam asked, feigning confusion. Salazar sighed, his breath creating a cloud in the cold air. "Mrs. Caldwell, we don't want to involve you in this unpleasantness. Emiliano made some very poor financial decisions and borrowed money he couldn't repay. This is simply a business matter. If you could just tell us where to find him and his daughter, you can go back to your quiet life." And what will happen to them? Miriam asked, abandoning the pretense of ignorance. Emiliano will work. Off his debt, Salazar said smoothly. The girl will be well cared for by relatives until he's able to provide for her properly again. No one needs to get hurt. Miriam didn't believe him for a second. The predatory gleam in his eyes told her everything she needed to know about what would really happen to Emiliano and Valeria if these men found them. I see, she said, as if considering his words. And if I were to know where they are, which I'm not saying I do, what guarantee would I have that your intentions are as benevolent as you claim? Salazar's face hardened slightly. Mrs. Caldwell, I don't think you understand the situation. These aren't negotiations. Tell us where Emiliano and the girl are, or things will become very uncomfortable for you. Miriam felt a surge of anger replace her fear. How dare these men threaten her? How dare they think they could intimidate a woman who had taught unruly teenagers for 30 years, who had nursed her husband through terminal cancer, who had endured the crushing loneliness of widowhood. Let me tell you what I understand, Mr. Salazar, she said, her voice low but intense. I understand that you're threatening a 72-year-old woman in a public park. I understand that whatever Emiliano owes you, it doesn't justify terrorizing a child. And I understand that if anything happens to me, the police will find a very detailed letter in my home explaining exactly who is responsible. It was a bluff, but one delivered with such conviction that uncertainty flickered across Salazar's face. You're making a mistake, Ramon warned. Perhaps, Miriam acknowledged, but it's my mistake to make. Now I believe this conversation is over. She moved to step around them again, and this time they let her pass, though she could feel their eyes boring into her back as she walked away. Her knees felt like jelly, and she was certain they must be able to hear her thundering heartbeat. But she maintained a steady pace, not too fast, not too slow. Once she was a safe distance away, she circled back toward the copse of trees where Valeria was hiding. Valeria, she called softly. It's safe now, you can come out. The little girl emerged cautiously, her face pale with fear. Were they the bad men? Yes, sweetheart, but they're gone now, Miriam assured her, taking her hand. But we need to get home quickly and tell your father what happened. They took a roundabout route back to the house, Miriam constantly checking to ensure they weren't being followed. When they finally reached home, Emiliano was already there, having returned from his morning shift at the warehouse. One look at their faces told him something was wrong. What happened? He demanded, gathering Valeria into his arms. Miriam explained the encounter with Salazar and Ramon, trying to downplay the threat to avoid frightening Valeria further, but making sure Emiliano understood the seriousness of the situation. They know we're here, he said, his face grim. We have to leave immediately. No, Miriam said firmly. That's exactly what they expect. They're probably watching the house right now, waiting for you to run. But we can't stay, Emiliano insisted. They'll come for us, and you'll be caught. In the middle. I won't put you in danger. I'm already in the middle, Miriam pointed out. They know I've been helping you. If you run now, they'll just assume I know where you've gone, and they'll come after me anyway. Emiliano paled at this realization. What have I done? I've brought this danger to your doorstep after all your kindness. What's done is done, Miriam said practically. The question is, what do we do now? They spent the rest of the day in tense discussion, formulating and discarding various plans. Emiliano wanted to turn himself over to Salazar, hoping his surrender might satisfy them enough to leave Valeria and Miriam alone. Miriam adamantly refused to consider this option. There must be another way, she insisted. How much do you owe them? More than I could hope to repay in my lifetime, Emiliano admitted, at least at the rate I'm currently earning. But there must be a figure, an actual number. Emiliano hesitated, then named a sum that made Miriam's eyebrows rise. It was substantial, not the millions she might have expected given the level of pursuit, but certainly far more than the average person could easily access. I see, she said thoughtfully. And is there anyone else who might help? Former business associates? Friends? Emiliano shook his head sadly. I approached everyone I could think of before we went into hiding. Some couldn't help, others wouldn't. I exhausted all possibilities. A plan was beginning to form in Miriam's mind, one that she wasn't sure Emiliano would agree to, but which might offer their best chance. I have some savings, she said carefully. Not enough to pay the full amount, but perhaps enough to negotiate. Absolutely not, Emiliano said immediately. I cannot accept more from you than you've already given. These men are dangerous. If they thought you were trying to play them,